Welcome back to Between Two FARS. If you joined us last time, you know that we're working through some of the basic issues and considerations that we need to keep in mind as we traverse these uncharted waters that have been churned up by the COVID-19 crisis. Now, last time we talked about the very basic principles of fiscal law, and Michael Mark joined us. He is a veteran contract attorney from Langley and really just helped us get the basics. Now, we're going to go a little bit deeper. The FAR implements these very basic fiscal law considerations and what we need to keep in mind as we're applying the CARES Act guidance and the NASA directives for implementing the CARES Act on our contracts. Now, we're not giving policy and we're not establishing any directives on what you should be doing, but we'd really like to raise some issues that we want you to keep in mind and consider as you chart your course for your individual contracts at your centers. Michael, it is so great to have you back. Are you ready to talk to us a little bit about how the fiscal law is implemented by the FAR?
Yes, I'm ready.
All right.
So the last time we talked, basically, remember about purpose, amount, and time. And I pointed out then that frequently we have contracts that vastly exceed the amount of money that's appropriated in any one given year. So how do we deal with that? Because we're not allowed to obligate funds in excess of what's been appropriated. And the way we do that in the FARS is we have two basic clauses for that, the limitation of cost clause and the limitation of funds clause. The limitation of cost clause is usually used for contracts where the costs are not going to cross fiscal years, the funding is not going to cross fiscal years. And the limitation of funds clause is when it does cross fiscal years. They both operate pretty much the same. And what they do is they say, okay, contractor, we are obligating X amount of dollars onto the contract, which should carry your work through a given period of time. And the clause sets a date by when that funding is expected to last. The contractor then has money and can begin to do the work. But the clause says, oh, if you reach a given percentage of the amount that we've allocated to the contract right now, and it's usually 75%, sometimes it's 85%, you are required to notify us in writing that you're reaching the limit, and then the government has the obligation to do one of two things. We can either send you more money or we can terminate the contract. The quid pro quo for all of this is that the clause specifically says that the contractor is not obligated to perform beyond the funding or the time that has been laid out under the clause, and the government is not obligated to pay any more than the amount that's already on the contract. That is the amount that's been funded. You'll notice that this is what we have up as a chart from the FAR. This is part 32, where it talks about these clauses and the two clauses and how they operate. And they're highlighting there that government personnel cannot encourage contractors. You can't wink and nod and say, oh, well, don't worry, we're going to be good for it. And they say it violates the revised statute, section 3679, which is the old version of the Anti-Deficiency Act, and the U.S. Code site is the current version. And as it says, the violator, who is the contracting officer usually, but it could be a program person as well, could be subject to both civil and or criminal penalties. In addition, there are also administrative penalties. They can be up to fired from their job, and certainly they can be put on leave without pay for some period of time, demoted, and other types of administrative actions. So
and that's why we're bringing this up now. We talked about the ADA and fiscal law in the last episode, and we're talking about this limitation of cost or funds clause and how those two things dovetail right here in this highlighted language. Because while we've been given new direction under the CARES Act, these provisions are still in effect. There's nothing in the CARES Act that altered our fiscal law obligations, are there?
No, the CARES Act doesn't do anything with regard to fiscal law. It will have one interesting thing, and it allows us to amend contracts without consideration, and we'll talk about that. Typically, you have to amend contracts you obtain consideration, which is either a reduction in the cost or some additional reports or. So we'll just let that thing go by.
Yes, we're right by Ellington Air Force Base, and I'm enjoying the great outdoors and the wonderful military and NASA planes flying overhead. Go team.
So yes. So anyway, typically we would obtain consideration when we amend a contract. In this case, we're not required to do that, and we'll talk about that. But these clauses protect both the contractor and the government. They often get into arguments about, did they give us the notice in time? Did they exceed the amount and then came to us? There's a lot of case law dealing with the application of these clauses. We don't really need to get into that. You just need to know they're there and that you need to pay attention to them, and you need to make sure the contractor is paying attention to them too, because you do not want to have your contract exceeding its value, which could then cause us to be required to come up with more money, or maybe to say under that clause we're not going to pay you. And there are a lot of cases where we've said that, and as often as not, I think probably more often than not, the government loses those cases. The courts and the boards tend to be fairly sympathetic to the contractors as long as they didn't really try to game the system, and occasionally they have. So
these are some very important considerations as we're moving forward and looking at what to do on our contracts as we're implementing some of these new advanced agreement policies and things that are being put out. You know what? I really do think we need to talk about how NASA is implementing the CARES Act. Why don't we come back again for another episode and talk a little bit about how the fiscal law policy and the FAR are going to be implemented properly under the new CARES Act. Will you come back and talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure.
That's terrific. See you next time between two FARs.